Hello, hello, hello. You are watching Ask Dr. Jill. We just had some fun technical difficulties, so we appreciate you being here. Um, and I would like to introduce the two wonderful people who are on screen with me. First of all, we have AFSP's Senior Vice President of Research, Dr. Jill Harkavy-Friedman, otherwise known as Dr. Jill. And she leads AFSP's research program, which funds research grants and helps nurture and train new researchers. And during her 35 years as a clinician and researcher, Jill has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and trained clinicians nationwide. And I could go on and on and on. Hi, Jill.
Hi, Brett. I'm so happy to be here with you today and with our special guest, who I know you're going to introduce now, but also with our listeners.
That's right. We couldn't do it without our listeners and our watchers.
Yeah.
Our audience. Yes, today's very special guest is Dr. Madelyn Gould, who is an expert on suicide contagion and safe reporting and storytelling. We honored her with AFSP's Lifetime Achievement Award as an outstanding researcher at our last Lifesavers Gala this year. And she's one of AFSP's scientific advisors and a member of our scientific council and an endowed professor of epidemiology and psychiatry at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She's also contributed extensive research to deepen our understanding of youth mental health and suicide prevention, as well as how asking directly if someone is experiencing suicidal thoughts is the right thing to do when someone's in crisis. And finally, she also provided expert guidance on AFSP's Talk Away the Dark campaign film, which highlights common warning signs for suicide and illustrates how someone can begin a caring conversation with someone in crisis. And we'll link to that below, I'm sure, for anyone who's interested. And finally, I'm Brett Wean. I'm AFSP's Director of Writing and Entertainment Outreach. And so I help provide guidance with TV and movies and musicians and messaging and things like that. So a lot of what we're talking about today, I am keenly interested in myself, and I'm so excited without further ado to get into it. We've gotten so many questions in advance, and we encourage you to send in your questions live as well. We'll try and take as many as we can. We're going to talk about reporting safety and storytelling safety in terms of suicide, and also how individuals can safely communicate regarding this topic. So welcome, both of you.
Oh, thank you for asking me to join you all. I'm excited.
We're glad to be here.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. So let's get right into it, if that's okay. So first of all, a phrase that comes up a lot is suicide contagion. And I'm wondering, and I'll direct this to you, Maddie, what's the difference? Here's a more specific thing. Aside from what is suicide contagion, one person wrote in asking what the difference is between a suicide cluster and suicide contagion. Is there a difference? Are they the same term to describe the same thing, or how does that work?
Okay, they're not the same terms. They're related terms, but they're not the same terms. That a cluster is one manifestation of suicide contagion. And I also want to say that, sometimes people are a little put off by the term, quote, contagion, especially now in the time that we're living in with COVID. So we often refer to it also as social transmission. It's just another way of you thinking about it. And so you may have social transmission or the influence of someone's suicide, another person's suicide, that doesn't result in a cluster, but can still influence someone else's motivation to engage in suicidal behavior. So it might be one other person, and that could still be what we would consider, and I'll use the term contagion. But a cluster is usually thought to be at least 3 people engaging in suicidal behavior in a relatively small geographic area within a relatively short period of time, although the time can vary and the place can vary. And you can have different types of clustering. You can have clustering that's only, in time. So that might be after some media presentation, so that it could be something online that would have no geographic boundaries, really, but you could still have clusters over time. After Robin Williams died by suicide, and there was extensive coverage, and really was such a beloved person, and it happens more with celebrities in general, you may get, again, across vast geographic areas, clustering in time, so that there are increases shortly after the person dies by suicide. And then you have clusters that are both in place and time. And so when people think about a cluster in a school or a cluster in a community, and so again, contagion is more the process, and a cluster is sort of a behavioral manifestation, of that process. Yeah. Hopefully that's clear to the person who asked that question. If not, make me do a little more work to explain it.
No, so in other words, when someone takes their own life, it can, perhaps having to do with the way people are reporting on it, or it's communicated about in a school or something like that. It can, if it's handled badly, it can sometimes encourage other people, unfortunately, to take their own lives.
Right. And if it's handled well, then it can prevent people from taking their own lives. And I know that was a focus that we wanted to, to make sure that we address. That it's not inevitable, right? It's not inevitable that if someone dies by suicide, it's not inevitable that someone else is going to be influenced in a negative way. I mean, you'll feel sad. You may get depressed. Clearly, that's a negative, impact. But it doesn't mean that someone else will engage in suicidal behavior. Because even after someone dies by suicide, we really need to remember to focus on help seeking, right? Focus on coping. Focus on, reaching out to others, both to help them and if you need help, to help yourself. And in that respect, we've seen that after someone died by suicide in schools, that other students, because when it's handled right, other students then come away being very motivated to make sure to help a friend who then shares a confidence that they're suicidal. That because someone has died by suicide, they take suicide more seriously. They recognize that it's reality. They don't want that to happen again. So that even after a horrible tragedy, positive things can occur if you focus on help seeking.
I just want to add also that it's not like this is going to make somebody suddenly suicidal, because that's not how suicide works. You can't just say something or do something and a person becomes, enters a suicidal crisis. Suicide risk is something that is dynamic. It changes over time. You might have some factors that make you more at risk, and yet you may never make a suicide attempt or die by suicide. So really, none of this is going to make a person who's feeling well and doing well suddenly become suicidal. We're really talking about the people that we're concerned about, and that this may stir up feelings for them if they're having their own crisis, and that's how the copying or the contagion can happen.
Exactly. I'm so glad that you emphasized that, Dr. Jill.
And so this is all really helpful. And for instance, I know one thing about safe reporting, and I assume it applies to other cases too in terms of this, is just including help resources and crisis resources for people. Like if you're reporting on a celebrity death, or, God forbid, someone in a school takes their own life, just including making sure everyone knows about the resources that are available to them. That can actually have a positive effect, because it helps spread that awareness, and people who are struggling realize that those options are available to them. And so I'm wondering, what are the other kind of guidelines? Like if there are reporters watching right now, or just anyone who's interested, what are some safe reporting guidelines, and how can people handle that responsibly?
Yeah, and there are quite a number of safe reporting guidelines and recommendations. So I would urge people to all you have to do is Google Google it, suicide reporting, and I think AFSP, so many, the WHO, so many organizations have safe reporting recommendations. It's absolutely necessary to provide those resources, as you mentioned, and as we were discussing, but it's not enough. That if you have a story that sensationalizes suicide, that glamorizes it in any way, that even inadvertently reinforces suicide as a way of getting out of problems, then if people think that it's okay to then just list resources, and that's great, and that just to list resources is certainly helpful, but it's not enough to undo some of the things that might motivate someone who is vulnerable. And as Jill mentioned, that someone who isn't at risk or doesn't have those sort of long-standing vulnerabilities and might not be impacted, but there are a lot of people who do have those, underlying long-standing vulnerabilities. And so you want to have preferably a story, it's hard with a celebrity, but that focuses on coping strategies if possible in face of a suicidal crisis, rather than focusing on a story that makes it seem as if the suicide was inevitable. And you want to have realistic and correct information about risks for suicide. That you don't want to simplify, even, Jill was just mentioning, there are many factors that go into contributing to someone's suicide risk. So you don't want to simplify it by just saying it was one thing. And that sometimes you see those stories. Years ago, things were really focusing on bullying. And we'd see things bully-side, or, things that are so inappropriate, because it's never going to be one factor. It's always going to be a number of different things that contribute to risk. So a story should present suicide with as much information, not necessarily about the person. You don't want to have the story be so personalized that other people will start identifying with the person. But with regard to understanding because we know so much now after decades of research of, what does increase risk and what does decrease risk. And that, as I mentioned, just, we've seen some, horrible stories after, I'll use Robin Williams as an example, even though it's been a number of years, where they had pictures of the genie because he was the genie in Aladdin. And then he said, oh, well, now you're free, because then the genie was free at the end. And you go, what inadvertent message is that giving to people, right? So now you die by suicide and you're free. That's not what we want to tell people who are in pain. That's not what we want to tell people who are trying to, in any way, really escape from the dire, situations that they're in, how they're feeling. And we don't want to tell them that suicide is an option. Right? They may already be thinking that suicide is an option. We want to give them other options. So that's what I meant by not inadvertently glamorizing suicide, right? Or reinforcing it as it's maladaptive, but people may think of it as a coping strategy. Yeah.
Maddie, I love your work and I read it all the time. And correct me if I'm wrong, but from my reading, it seemed like other things that are important to think about when you're reporting on suicide is not to use the word suicide in the title, not to include the method that somebody used, and certainly not to use them together and have it be repeated over and over and over again. That because that's like having a neon sign flash in your eyes. But like you said, include messages of hope, include messages of what can be done, and not to describe exactly what the person did. First of all, not just because you don't want to stimulate that in somebody, but also if you've lost someone to suicide, like half the population has lost someone to suicide, and if they happen to have died by that method, it can bring up the pain, it can bring up the trauma. So really avoiding things that keep talking about the suicide death itself, but rather talking about, like you said, risk factors, warning signs. What can you do if you are feeling suicidal, or somebody you care about is feeling suicidal? How do you have that conversation, which is a lot of what we want to also talk about today. So in case you don't know, Dr. Gould did all the landmark studies related to how we talk about suicide, so that we can prevent somebody from taking their life just because it was stimulated, a person at risk was stimulated by something. And it's not going to be just one thing. Again, you're not going to just say something and make somebody suicidal. It simply doesn't work that way.
Right. I'd also urge people not to have excessive number of stories. Jill was getting to that as well. That and that's why it very often happens after a celebrity's death by suicide. There's not just one story. Then there's another story, and then it goes online, and then it gets repeated, and then people will send it to other people. And it's that excessive number of repetitions that we also know are much more likely to lead to a significant increase in the numbers of people who die by suicide. So it's what you say and the number of times that you say it.
Yeah. Thank you.
So this is great. And so it's important, just to reiterate again, don't get too into the manner of how they did it in a story. And I assume so many people wrote in about schools and young people. And I think of a school that has had a suicide death, and they need to figure out how to message. And we have resources for that, actually.
Yeah, there's a great tool online called After Suicide, a toolkit for schools. And it's really meant to help guide schools, but also, family and parents can look at it about what to do after someone dies by suicide, because it's unexpected. It's a sign that somebody was in terrible pain, and it affects people. They used to say that one suicide affected 6 people, but that doesn't even really make sense. But actually, research shows that on average, believe it or not, about 135 people are affected when one person dies by suicide, and can have that, broader impact. So we need to help each other during those moments, but we want to do it in a safe way that's going to offer help and hope.
Years ago, schools refused to even talk about suicide. They thought that people would feel, protected or safer, and I think they were just so scared themselves because they didn't have a tool, that is now a resource that you've developed, and that we now, out of respect for the surviving community, you need to talk about it. And so it's not to stigmatize talking about suicide. You don't want people to engage in suicidal behavior, but we don't want to stop people from feeling comfortable to report about their own, suicidal thoughts, or for family members who have lost a loved one to, friends who've lost someone to suicide. We want them to be able to talk about the person, to grieve the person appropriately, and not to, feel stigmatized by it. So I'm so delighted that I had some, input into that resource, because it's just a wonderful resource, after a suicide. That maybe you'll want to put that on the screen too, how folks can get that from you all, because I know that schools and communities in general are using that resource.
And, it makes me think also of how wording matters and the phrases we use matter. So one thing that I've been pleasantly surprised in terms of how media reports on suicide that's changed is we encourage people not to use the phrase commit suicide because, it's a health-related crisis. You're not committing a crime. And one of our audience members wrote in sort of, I think, an extra credit question is how I see it. They say, I have read that the phrase, so what you're supposed to say rather than commit is died by suicide. That's one of the ways you can say it. But this person writes in, I have read that the phrase died of suicide is better than died by suicide because, for example, people die of cancer and not die by cancer. So is there a difference or what? I'm so curious what your response is going to be.
I have learned so much from folks during the 40 years that I've been working in this area, because back in the day, people did say, committed suicide. And surviving family members would, for what you were just saying, they didn't, commit a crime, and that it went to die, by suicide. And now with that question in mind, and I've heard it before, that comment, that perhaps we should be moving towards died of suicide in the same way that it's, died of cancer. There aren't any research studies that have examined whether either phrase is more stigmatizing, but sometimes you don't need a research study if, there's what's called, face validity. And if people who have been impacted by suicide are feeling offended by the term died by suicide, maybe we should start getting used to saying died of suicide. Anything that's new, a new phrase, takes getting used to. So all I can really say in response to that suggestion is that we should all take it seriously and really respect the folks who have, lived experience, and they can, let us know when we could be doing things better.
In addition, research does show that suicide is its own entity that cuts across, for instance, all mental health condition diagnoses, all kinds of social factors and environmental factors, and it's its own entity. It has its own biology. So in a way, it makes so much sense to say died of suicide, and because, like I say, died of lung cancer, died of diabetes, so I think we should reconsider that. I think it's a really helpful point.
Yeah,
it's a great question.
That today here,
everyone. And I remember when I started AFSP about not quite 8 years ago. I was thinking, how am I going to get used to saying this phrase, died by suicide? And it's, it was not as hard as I thought, and I've been just so heartened by seeing it in newspapers and media reporting, and it took off way faster than I realized. So that's great. I wanted to ask, I think in early research, tell me if I'm wrong, but it showed that newspapers showed the greatest potential to influence suicide contagion in the general population and with youth. I'm wondering if that's changed, because I think of like the advent of the internet and social media. What are your thoughts in terms of safe communication about suicide on social media?
Yeah, I think the earlier studies showed that, because the earlier studies were focusing on that. It was before social media and online communications. It's hard for, I'm sure that for many of the people in the audience, it's hard to believe that there was a time before online communication, but there was. And that right now, with regard to the speed of communication and the accessibility of communication via, online communication and social media, that we're very concerned about the impact of communications via social media. And, with regard to influencing people's behavior in many different ways, right? But certainly suicide being one of them. And now the research is catching up. So it's with regard to focusing on, well, it's no longer Twitter, but tweets, but with regard to communication via online channels and platforms. And so we can't think that because much of the communication has shifted to online platforms that we're safe, that we don't have to consider, reporting recommendations.
Yeah, it's really similar online to written and also movies and entertainment in that, when you have positive messages that bring hope, that can change things one way. When you have negative messages or repeated use of words and methods, that, it could be detrimental. It turns out that there's a lot of really helpful information on social media. Most of the information is actually quite helpful. And there are so many resources on social media that you didn't have in the printed word. So while the same guidance, I think, research is showing, don't show methods, don't keep repeating it, have hopeful messages. There are a lot of resources for people online. So it's a little bit different because of the interactive nature of going online. So while it can be really detrimental, there's also a lot of really positive things that can happen there.
Yeah, I would never propose to get rid of.
Yeah. No. I don't think so.
I'm saying that. And so, clearly there are resources and so many positive things and sense of community and identity, and especially for folks who are, isolated. But we still shouldn't forget the responsibilities that we all have as sort of citizen journalists, for want of another word, to think before we share information, to think before we write, to think before we react. Because when someone does die of suicide and it is, public information on some forum, think, how will my comment affect other people? So we just need that, a shared responsibility.
Absolutely. And I think part of the reason why we're talking about it like this, and part of the reason why things like contagion can happen, is that in many instances, even for somebody who's been thinking about it for a long time, the actual engaging in suicidal behavior often happens pretty quickly. And there's sort of this increase in risk during a crisis. But if we get past those periods of increased risk, then the risk goes down again. People start to feel better again. And so that's how some of the interventions that are really helpful, they put time and space between a person and actually engaging in suicidal behavior. So when something's there and it's in your face, and you're in a crisis, it's going to be much more impactful. But if you can get through that time, most of the time, you won't even make a suicide attempt and certainly not die by suicide. So some of it is just helping to have a crisis moment, either for a person who's planned it for a long time. It's still the moment where action takes place. And we know when people survive attempts, especially even very serious attempts, they are glad they're still alive. Their life may not be perfect, but they're glad that they're alive so that they can work to make it better.
And those are the stories that need to be shared. It's so important for other people to know that those folks are glad to be alive.
Yeah.
And to, because otherwise you don't have a chance to fix anything. And that with the message is also that, recovery is real. Mm-hmm. That people really don't think that you can get better from, a suicidal or mental health crisis, and you can. I mean, there are plenty of people who are walking around who are, have gone on to have, satisfying, productive lives, who were suicidal as teenagers or suicidal as young adults, who may have attempted suicide, and as you say, Jill survived it. And those are the stories that all of us need to hear.
Yeah, and we know when somebody's in that state, that their thinking becomes what we call like a tunnel vision. It becomes more limited. So they feel terrible. They're in terrible pain. They feel they're never going to get out of it. Nothing's going to change. But even for people who feel that way in the moment, when you get through that with time, you have a chance to readjust, to de-escalate. And that's why sometimes when bad things happen, people go to that place. But if you can help them make it through that time, and it doesn't have to be long, it can be 10 minutes, an hour, or 2 hours. Sometimes it's weeks and more. But once you can open up the thinking a little bit, then whatever felt so devastating will feel less devastating. You'll start to feel like, okay, maybe I can do something. And that opens up the opportunity to get back to life. So you could feel really terrible, but if you get through that, there's a good chance that you'll figure it out and have be alive and have a decent life.
Right. And so I noticed too that you're on the bottom, they're saying the suicide prevention lifeline, and you can call 988 or text the crisis text line, and you can text 988 as well. But, by calling or chatting or texting 988, it can give you that opportunity where you can have that crisis de-escalate.
Exactly.
So I'm glad that you have that stream down there.
And I just want to say that Dr. Gould has done the major studies in evaluating the effectiveness of the 988 and the suicide prevention lifeline. And it makes a big difference. And 80% of people who call feel better by the end of the call. That's big. But it's because of what we were talking about that suicidal crisis de-escalating when you start to, I think of it like a balloon, that when you don't tell anybody, you feel like you're going to burst. But then once you let the air out a little bit, there's relief, and that pressure dissipates, and then you can start problem solving. In fact, we found funded research that showed that's what happens, is that if people on the other end listen actively for a while, the person starts to de-stress, and then as their stress level goes down, they are able to problem solve.
Right.
And the person on the other end can help them do that.
Right.
So the time and connection are really important.
Yeah.
Well, this is also fascinating and helpful. And I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about how individuals can, give people some do's and don'ts and help them. And I actually want to jump in with a really specific question that someone wrote in to just get into it. And then we can sort of back up a little bit and give more general stuff. But this one touches my heart for a very personal reason, because of personal experience. They ask, what do you recommend for taking care of a loved one who is battling depression but is resistant to therapy? So, in other words, we often say, like, oh, encourage someone to get, ask directly, encourage someone to get help. But then and sometimes that's all you need, and for the person just to feel listened to and all that. But sometimes it's trickier than that, and someone just pushes you off. They don't want to talk about it, or they don't want to get help. What's some conversational judo, or what are some things to avoid also that you can use to help these people?
Yeah. When I think about this, I think of 4 words: compassion, respect, patience, and persistence, because you can't make them. But if you are non-judgmental, so you want to say things like, I'm here to listen. I really care about you. I want to help you through this. This may take some time, but we'll get through it together. I know, I don't know how you're feeling, but I'm here to listen. And to avoid judgmental statements like, oh, you have everything to live for. What are you so depressed about? All the negative things that don't really help, because depression is a health condition. And the person's thinking is different, and they don't have access to their usual capacity. And sometimes I'll even say, you know, that's your depression talking. So I think it's terrible to feel depressed. It's a horrible feeling. To just appreciate that. Don't give up on the person. But I would say you can't change them, and you don't want to put them in a position where they have to prove to you that it makes sense that they're depressed and it makes sense that they want to kill themselves. So you don't want to argue with them. So listen to them. I do this thing sometimes where if there are resources on paper, I kind of lay them out on the coffee table and walk away, you know, and let people take their time to look at it. And I do find that works, or sharing material, but keeping the door open for conversation. Unfortunately, you can't make somebody get help. Otherwise, you know, we wouldn't be such a big problem. Letting them know you're there, you care about them, you can hear what they have to say, and that there are people and resources where they can get help. And just don't give up on them.
One thing I want to...
Sorry, I just want to add,
please go on.
There's not much to add because Jill was wonderful with how she described to, you know, what you should say and do with someone who's depressed. I just also wanted to add one thing, that to let the person know that they're not a burden to you or to anyone. Because that's how they're going to feel, that they are a burden. And, you know, we've heard some really heartbreaking stories. We know it's been reinforced by research as well, but these sort of anecdotal stories or whatever, where someone who had trusted me, who was a suicide prevention advocate and trusted me enough to share the audio, the recordings that her then 16-year-old son had left for her before he died of suicide. Now this was decades later. And he just very clearly said that, I know I've made your life so much harder, and that this will make it, and I've been a burden. And even though, you know, in the short term, this will be horrible for you, I know in the long term it will be better for you. Well, clearly that's not the case, but, you know, his very distorted thinking made him believe that. And so, as Jill said, to really let the person know that you are there for them no matter what, and their depression is not a burden to you, what would be a burden to you if they weren't around.
You know, I was working with someone who was feeling suicidal, not depressed, by the way, just felt they had no future. And said those very words, my kids will get over it. And this is before I started working at AFSP, in full disclosure. And I said, your children will never, ever, ever get over it. And if you don't believe me, go to afsp.org, right, and you'll see that you don't get over it. And to me, one of the signs that people really don't have access to the usual coping, you know, sometimes they say people are not connected, but I think people are connected. They just have a dysfunctional connection, a DYS connection. And that's how they, like you were saying, Maddie, they can say, I love my family and my family loves me, so I'm a burden and they'll be better off without me. Right. So they're very connected, but they have the faulty assumption that they're actually going to help their family by not being there. Right. And we've heard that so many times. So letting people know they matter to you is an important part of doing it. You know, not guilt tripping them, but just letting them know that you love them, you care about them, you're going to go through it with them, and that even if they're asking things of you, you're willingly doing it because you want them to be around and you want them to feel better, because they are asking things of you, or they feel they are. And that's okay. We ask things of each other all the time. It's just their thinking makes them think that it's not okay.
And it's a mental health situation. People, you know, in terms of like, oh, I'm a burden to you, would you be thinking of it that way if you were talking about a physical health situation? Probably, in most cases, you probably would not. So I find that to be a helpful way of thinking about it too.
I'm laughing because I broke my foot, and my husband was like, I was definitely a burden to him, but I don't think he wanted me gone. But I know he never wants me to break my foot again. And, it's just like when you love someone and they're not feeling well mentally, like you want them to feel better, and you don't ever want them to feel that way again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing I didn't want to get past, because I think you guys are both familiar or conducted studies in this, the question of, well, it's sort of a myth that a lot of people worry that if they're concerned about someone, they suspect they're thinking about suicide, they worry that asking them directly is going to put the idea in their head, or it's going to push that person to actually take their own life. What has research shown involving that? I want to make that really clear for people.
Yeah, I am particularly proud, I have to admit, of the research that we did and published in 2005, because it was the first study that showed that it is a myth. It is safe to ask someone about suicide. It's not going to put ideas into people's heads, but people were very scared of that. And the reason that we conducted the research is that at the time we were trying to implement some suicide screening programs in schools, and school administrators were saying to us, "Oh, no, you can't ask about suicide. You're going to put ideas into people's heads." And I was on, and I still am, our institutional review board, which is for the protection of, human people, participants in research. And way back in the day, even members of the IRB were saying, no, you can't have questions asking about suicide because you're going to be putting ideas into, people's heads. And we said, you know what, we have to study this. And what we found is not only is it safe, not only don't you put ideas into people's heads, but if you don't ask about suicide to someone who is feeling suicidal, it creates more distress. And now there have been numerous studies since our study was conducted that have, in using different methodologies and doing different populations and so on, that have, shown exactly the same thing, that it's safe to ask about suicide, and it is distressing not to ask about suicide, when someone is suicidal. So so people who are watching this, and hopefully people who aren't watching this, because I want this message to be to everybody, ask someone if they're feeling, suicidal. They're thinking that they may hurt themselves, that they may kill themselves. It's not going to put ideas into someone's head. It's not a new idea. Right. And if they say no, then ask it again. Don't just ask it once. And if they say no, don't say, "Oh, that's good." Right. Because then the person will get the message, "Oh, I better not share that with you. If you, all of a sudden show such signs of relief that they said no." But if you really are scared, don't push yourself to do something that you really don't feel you can do. And if you don't know what to do, if they do say yes, then try to get help for yourself to either figure out how to ask someone or get someone else to ask it. You know what I mean? We have to live with who we are too. So don't, if you're saying, "Oh no, I could never do that," it's probably not true. Probably you could do that. With some even little bit of training, you could be, feeling more comfortable and more capable to ask someone about suicide. And if you do, it's safe. But if you don't know how to ask, then, you can actually call up 988 or text 988 for help, not just about yourself, but about getting help for somebody else. So if you really don't know how to ask it or know how to do it, you could text 988 and say, "Look, I'm with someone, I'm really worried about them, and I don't know what to do. Can you help me?" And they'll help you. They'll help you figure it out, how to engage the person, how to maybe even get the person to be on the line with someone with 988. So it's really important for us to realize that there are things that we can do and that we really probably are capable of asking, and that if you do, or when you do, that it's safe. You're not making the situation worse. You're making the situation better by asking someone.
I think that really brings us to talk away the dark. But
Yes.
I think you make a couple of really good points, which is if you don't feel comfortable, talk to your friends and family or people that know the person, see if they're seeing what you see. And, you may not be the person for them to talk to. That's okay. That happens a lot with parents. You may not, maybe it's the aunt. And no matter how you feel about that, you want it to be you in those situations, let it be somebody else. And also sometimes people hide it very well. So you're not always going to know when to ask. But that's why it is important to learn the risk factors and some of the warning signs so that you can, trust the feeling you have. If you're thinking of asking, then you're seeing something. And sometimes it helps to say, I noticed that you haven't come to school or you haven't been with the group lately, and what's going on? What do you want to talk? And we have some really great guides called the Real Convo Guides that were developed by our friend Brett Wean. And they're on our website. We also have Seize the Awkward, which is geared towards teenagers and young adults, but I love it too, which has a lot of examples of how to talk to someone. And so it brings us to Talk Away the Dark, which you so kindly shared your professional expertise with us to help us develop this public service announcement.
I'm so glad that you asked me. I mean, it really, as you know, I've spent decades doing research, but what gives me the most, I'll say, pleasure is, making sure that I contribute in a real way to suicide prevention. And
Talk Away the Dark. It shows you how to do it.
Exactly. I was so impressed with the folks who were, including Brett, who, were developing the whole, the whole conversation that takes place between a daughter and her, her father, who is clearly at risk for engaging in suicidal behavior. Yeah.
I'm wondering thank you, Jill, for working that in, because I wanted to get to that too. So this is a short film that you could see. We'll share a link below at the Talk Away the Dark campaign page, and where you can also, by the way, find those Real Convo Guides, which give you tips on how to have conversations. I'm wondering Maddie, what struck you? I'm trying to think back, because it was such a long process of working with the filmmakers and the creative team in terms of pinning down what that story was going to be. And the film kind of in a narrative way highlights, the daughter trying to ask her father about how are you feeling? I've noticed you're changing, your behavior's changing a bit. What were some of the things that struck you in those conversations about the safety of that narrative? Does anything come to mind in terms of the kinds of notes we were giving?
Yeah, what I was really impressed about was the creative, well, it can be creative in lots of ways, but I'll say, the people who were writing the scripts and developing the graphics for it and the whole narrative, had some, I could say at the beginning, misconceptions of, suicide risk and how you would, present the storyline. And they really listened, right, to all of us, who work in the area of suicide prevention, to get the, to get the story right, to get the communication right, to, show the vulnerability of this dad in so many different ways, right? By nonverbal communication with his daughter, as well as what he was saying with his daughter. They got the lighting right. I mean, as the story, to really come out of the darkness, and it was a very hopeful communication. in story, and that I think by the time, and it's relatively short, yet it goes from, feeling very, rightly so, disturbing and heavy to feeling light and hopeful, just watching it. So I think that's what impressed me the most, in a short period of time. How do you capture all of the risk factors? So it couldn't, there, so many different scenarios that could have been portrayed, and this is one of them. But it, it was very realistic, yet also empowering. That's what I was very impressed, that the daughter was empowered, and I'm hoping that people who watched it will feel empowered as well. And I think the father too, by the end, was empowered to do something about his depression. So that's at least
to me. I was just going to say, to me, I think one thing that wasn't there from the beginning that came out of many, many conversations was that decision to make it a series of conversations.
Oh, yes.
And I think there's something really powerful in that realization. People worry about, how can I safely communicate with someone who is at risk? Or if I'm at risk, how can I safely communicate with someone else about how I need some support? I'm feeling this way and I need to tell you, and it's hard. People think that they have to get it perfectly right and it's going to be one conversation. And the reality is, chances are, you might pick the wrong time, or the person might not be ready to talk about it. And it's just about gentle persistence, I guess.
Yeah, I like that, persistence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it shows that you're there for the long haul, that
Right.
you can listen. You're not forgetting, it's a real caring. It's not just something in passing, ask once, say, okay, fine, but that you really do care. And that conveys that you really do want to know, and you really do want to be there. And I think it can be reassuring for someone to see, I'm not going to scare them off because they keep approaching me, and yeah, I think the tension of him wanting to talk builds over the course of that, because when you ask, then that's when first you feel like, no, I'm not going to tell anybody, I'm just going to feel it. And then you think, well, maybe they do want to know, and then, well, maybe I can tell them, maybe I'll try in some way, and then gradually that builds the conversation. So
Right. Yeah, people, I think that's so important. I mean, everything that people are saying is so important. But the idea that, you're not just going to snap your fingers and magically someone's going to feel better, or, everything will get better. And so I do think that gentle persistence is such a wonderful thought to put out there for everyone. Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah.
It makes me think of, in terms of, our work with TV and movies and storytelling in general, or even, when I'm editing a blog and sharing someone's story, whether it's about loss or about their lived experience, you want to, and I think in popular entertainment too, TV and movies, it used to be like one special episode where someone is having a problem and then you never hear about it again. And just, I really appreciate stories in film and movies where it doesn't sugarcoat it. It feels authentic and real. So people who have been through something like that feel seen, but it does, in a realistic way, land on a message of hope. So I wanted to put that out there. And we have about, a little bit less than 10 minutes left. And I kind of, in looking over all the questions we've gotten, well, here's one really interesting one. It's a tricky question, so I'm just curious about that. And then I have a couple more if we have time. Someone wrote in today, what about persons with disabilities? Those who navigate life with a disability are at a greater risk, i.e., a deaf person cannot call 988. A person who is blind or impaired cannot read resources?
Oh.
I will call on Jill. Jill volunteers to start this tribute.
Sorry, but I get excited about how accessible all this is. So there are a few things. One is, if you need help, there is actually there's sign interpreted and TTY available for 988. So, and you can pick up a phone and call. So no matter if you can't pick up a phone, but you can communicate in some way to someone else that you want them to pick up a phone. Or there are ways, no matter how extreme your disability is, 988 is there for you. Other people are there for you. It's highly accessible. So the second thing is that part of it has to do with, I mean, it's your mental set. It's how you're feeling. Your mental set is determined by how you're feeling also, because we see people going through the most difficult and extraordinary experiences and kind of fighting for every breath. And, I think even when we have a disability, when we first have that disability, I don't want to speak for people with disabilities, but, often you feel like your life has changed so much, you're never going to have a life. And somehow with time, with experience, with living, you can learn how to have a life. And it's probably not going to be the life you thought it was, but it's still worth living. And so if you have a disability and you're feeling distraught, getting some help, and also working with other people, there are support groups in every community, every disability group. If you're not sure, you can go to the National Health Council, has a list of lots of groups where people can connect. So there's a difference, and this is in suicide, there's a difference between how you think things are and how they can be. So try not to get stuck in what you think it is, and explore what's possible. And that's kind of what hope is, to think that there's something that I can do to make this better. When we're in those periods of deep pain and feeling like we can't, that's if you can let somebody help you, let them help you. But there's probably more accessibility, more access to care, and ways to change things to make it more livable and better. And I know that may sound Pollyannish, but we've seen, give it a chance. There may be more than you think. And I've worked a lot with people with pain conditions and things like that. And you have to know what you can do, and then create a plan for managing that condition or that pain, so that you can have things in your life that you want, even if it's different from how you thought it was going to be.
That is such a wonderful, heartening answer, Jill. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm getting greedy with how many questions we can take. I want to get to a couple about communicating in terms of loss. We haven't really touched on that yet today, and we've gotten some questions. Here's a great basic one. How do you answer the question, how did your husband die, or how did your child die, whoever it was, if they died by suicide? What's a good way of, what would you advise, either of you, in terms of how to have that conversation and to respond to someone who's asking?
I think it depends on who's asking, right? There are people that you might feel comfortable sharing details about, not just by dying of suicide, but dying by any means, in terms of how much do you want to share about the pain you're going through with anyone. So the first thing I'd say is, you're not responsible for someone else's, to answer somebody else's question. I mean, I'm not saying to be rude, but it depends on what you think the person's motivation is in asking the question. If they're, if it's someone that who really deeply cares about you and wants to be there for you, and then you say what you would say about any cause of death. You'd say that, my husband died of suicide. That, he's been depressed for X number of time, and whatever the situation is, I don't think you need to skirt around the issue or avoid saying that it's suicide. You shouldn't be ashamed. It's not any more ashamed if the person died of a heart attack or in a car accident or so on. But I think that in that situation, folks need to protect themselves as well by how much you want to share in terms of your grief for what the person's situation is. Jill may have different advice to give to the person, but I would not mention that it was suicide, because we don't want to continue the stigma, and that we know that grief is complicated, and we feeling guilty about a death, where it's suicide in contrast to another cause of death, is something that really should be a thing of the past. I mean, to feel depressed, clearly, to feel overwhelmed, to feel, that you need help either, we know that in our community, when someone has experienced an illness or a death in the family, we always bring over food, I mean, just some instrumental support, just to make sure that, it's not trivial. You want to make sure that someone who's grieving is taking care of themselves, that they're eating, that they're hopefully sleeping, and so on. But focusing on the person's life, is a very uplifting thing to engage in when you're grieving someone. That you may want to talk about the death a little bit, especially at the beginning, but then you want to really focus on, all the things that were meaningful in the person's life. And so it's how we might want to respond to somebody, but I want to just flip this conversation, that is that think twice before you ask somebody. If you know that someone has experienced the death of someone that they care about, maybe rather than asking them, oh, how did they die, maybe you could say, what can I do for you? I know that it must be really hard right now, and is there anything I can do? I mean, anything, do you, with regard to, so I would say, people should be sensitive to what the person who's grieving from any cause of death,
Right.
What they're going through. And that if it's merely curiosity, then don't ask the question. You know what I mean? I think that we need, as I think it was Jill who mentioned, and maybe you did too, Brett, in terms of being respectful. It's about respect and caring about someone. So, but
No, I was just going to say, to build on what you're saying, sometimes people actually want to know the method that somebody used. And I think it's the same thing, that you can say, I'd rather not say, or you can say what happened, or but the process of healing is a process. So what you say in the first night or the first week may be very different from what you say 3 months down the road or a year down the road. So and you'll also, if you go to, for instance, support groups where other people have experienced it, or we have a program called Healing Conversations, where you can talk with somebody who's further out from the loss, and when you're early in the course, and have a conversation with them, you'll figure it out, and it's going to seem challenging. Sometimes, how many children do you have? And if you lost a child, you're going to have to figure out how you want to answer that question. But if somebody asks about what did they do, it's up to you if you want to answer. And you can also just answer with a one-word answer. I don't think they're necessarily asking for details. Or you can say, I'd rather not say, it's too disturbing, it's too upsetting, or, that's his privacy or her privacy or whatever. But you have a say in what you say. And I do think it's likely that over your healing journey, you're going to have different answers for that question.
Thank you both so much. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. We're actually over time now. This was such a fantastic conversation. Dr. Gould, I want to thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Gould.
Thank you so much for asking me. It's really always a pleasure to be with you.
I always love learning from both of you, Jill similarly.
So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to let Brett have the last word, but I want to say thank you both to Dr. Gould, but also to all of you for asking such important and meaningful questions, and for being with us today and sharing your journeys as well.
So I'll just end this with, I didn't mention that September is National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. Check out the Talk Away the Dark page. There's so many ways you can get involved and make a difference, whether it's bringing education to your community through our education programs, looking into our loss programs and making sure people in your community know about it. Sign up for an Out of the Darkness walk. That's an amazing thing you can do, where you can talk to other people who just get it. And become a volunteer advocate. Again, there's so many ways. Go to our website. Thank you also to the Mighty. I've loved this conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.